Let's get started. Story number 1.
The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse as the clock ticked past midnight. Sarah sat in the kitchen, the dim glow of a single light bulb illuminating the worn wooden floors and the chipped, yellowing walls. She had moved to the house only a few weeks ago, inheriting it from an aunt she barely remembered. The house was isolated, situated on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick woods that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. But it was peaceful, or so she had thought. The first few days were spent unpacking, cleaning, and settling in, but after a while, Sarah started to notice the odd things. Little sounds in the night, a door that she was sure she had closed now open, footsteps in the hall when she was the only one there. She brushed them off as nerves, nothing more than her imagination playing tricks on her. But tonight, something was different. She had just finished making a cup of tea when she heard it again, the soft thump from upstairs. It was subtle, almost like the sound of someone walking slowly across the floor, but the house was supposed to be empty. She was the only one here. It was late, and Sarah figured it was just the house settling. Houses, especially old ones like this, made strange noises. But the sound continued, growing louder, more deliberate. Her pulse quickened as she glanced toward the staircase. The house felt suddenly cold, and her skin prickled with unease. She set down her tea, her fingers trembling, and stood. She didn't want to go upstairs. There was something unnerving about the silence that followed the thumping, as if it were waiting for her to make a move. But she had to. Curiosity pushed her forward. The wooden stairs creaked under her weight as she climbed, each step seeming louder than the last. She reached the top and stood at the edge of the hallway, listening. The house was eerily still now, as though it were holding its breath. There was no one there, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She walked down the hallway to the room at the end, the one that had been her aunt's. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. With a shaky hand, she pushed it open. The room was just as it had been left, untouched for years. The bed, the dresser, the small vanity mirror. But something felt off. The air was thick in here, heavy with a presence that didn't belong. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she fought the urge to turn and run. That was when she saw it. The faintest shadow in the corner of the room, almost as if someone were standing there. But when she looked, there was nothing, no one. The temperature dropped suddenly, a chill that sank deep into her bones. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. That's when she heard it. A whisper, low and soft, barely audible. It was coming from the corner, the one where the shadow had been. Sarah? She froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart slammed against her chest. She knew that voice. It was her aunt's voice. She hadn't heard it in years, not since she was a little girl, but the sound of it now, so close and yet so distant, sent a wave of terror through her. Sarah, come closer. The whisper was like a command, and despite every ounce of fear in her body, Sarah found herself moving toward the corner, drawn by the voice, unable to resist. Her legs felt like lead, but she couldn't stop herself. As she approached, she noticed the temperature growing colder, the air thick with something she couldn't explain. The shadow was still there, but now it seemed to shift, almost like it was alive. She could hear a faint rustling, a sound that didn't belong in the stillness of the room. Sarah reached out, her hand trembling as she extended it toward the dark figure. That's when she saw it, the outline of a face, pale and gaunt, staring at her with hollow eyes. The skin was paper-thin, stretched tight over bones, and the mouth twisted into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was a grotesque, unnatural grin that made her stomach turn. The figure leaned closer, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized she could no longer move. Her feet were glued to the floor, and the whispering voice grew louder. Sarah! The voice was no longer comforting or familiar. It was cold, empty, hollow. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Panic surged through her chest, and she willed herself to break free, to run, but her body refused to obey. The figure reached out, its cold, bony fingers brushing against her cheek. Sarah gasped in horror, and that's when everything went dark. She woke up in her bed, her body drenched in sweat, her heart still racing. The room was quiet, the air still. It had all been a dream. It had to have been. But as she sat up, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The same cold, bony fingers that had touched her in the dream were now visible in the mirror across from her bed. She could see them, pale and translucent, just inches from her face. Her breath came in short gasps as she reached for her phone, her hands shaking. She checked the time, 2:15 a.m. She had been asleep for nearly 2 hours. But the fingers, they were still there, hovering in the reflection. Terrified, she scrambled out of bed, her feet stumbling over the tangled sheets. She backed away slowly, her eyes locked on the mirror, unable to tear her gaze away from the spectral hands. They lingered there, cold and unyielding, before slowly fading away. Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears as she turned and bolted for the door. She had to get out of the house. She had to leave before whatever it was could come back. She ran downstairs, her feet pounding against the old wooden floors. She wasn't sure what had happened, whether it had been a nightmare, a hallucination, or something far worse. But as she reached the front door, she stopped in her tracks. The door was wide open, and standing in the doorway was a figure. She couldn't make out the details, but she knew who it was. Her aunt. "Sarah, come home." The voice was soft, almost pleading. But Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned and ran out the door and into the cold night air, not stopping until she reached her car. She didn't care where she was going. She didn't care if the house had some unfinished business, some long-held secret. She just needed to get away. As she sped down the winding road, she looked back at the house in her rearview mirror. For a split second, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the window, watching her. But when she blinked, it was gone. She never returned to the house. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was the kind of night that made the shadows in the corners of rooms seem a little darker, a little more menacing. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows of the house and making the trees sway like they were reaching out to touch it. The kind of night that made you want to lock every door, close every curtain, and settle under blankets until the morning came. But for Rachel, the night felt different. It felt oppressive. She had recently moved into an old house on the outskirts of town, a place that had belonged to her late grandmother. The house was big, too big for one person, really, but it had always been a comforting space when she was younger. There was something familiar about it, even if it felt abandoned now, filled with boxes, the remnants of a life that had once filled every room. Rachel had been staying in the house for about a week, adjusting to the quiet life away from the city, the bustle of work, and the noise of everyday life. The house had always been a bit rundown. No one had lived in it for a while, but she thought she could fix it up. It was hers now, after all. At first, everything had seemed fine. Sure, there were strange noises, creaks in the floorboards, doors that seemed to close on their own, whispers that faded as soon as she turned her head. She blamed it on the house settling. After all, it was an old place. But as the days wore on, Rachel began to feel like she was being watched. And it wasn't just the usual feeling. This was different. Something was wrong. Something just beneath the surface. It was around midnight on one of those nights, the kind of night when the darkness feels like a weight pressing in on your chest, that Rachel was in the living room sorting through some old photo albums she had found in one of the closets. She had been so caught up in the photos, memories of family reunions, old vacations, her grandmother's life, that she didn't notice the silence creeping in. No wind, no sounds from outside. The house felt too still. It wasn't until she heard it that she snapped back to reality. A soft, muffled thud like something heavy falling upstairs. Rachel froze, her hand hovering over a photo of her grandmother, young and smiling. The sound had come from upstairs, near the guest bedroom. She waited, straining to hear, but the house remained silent. Just the faint sound of the old grandfather clock ticking in the corner. She slowly stood up, a chill creeping down her spine. Her grandmother had always warned her about the house. "Don't stay too long in the dark, Rachel," she'd say, voice low, almost a whisper, as though she was imparting a secret. Rachel had always dismissed it. It was just her grandmother's superstitions, the kind of things older people said to get attention. But now, as she stood there in the dim light of the living room, something about the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with anticipation. The house was quiet again, too quiet. The only sounds were the occasional creaks of the floorboards beneath her feet. She moved toward the stairs, her footsteps slow, deliberate, as though she could will herself not to feel afraid. But the further she went, the more the tension in the air seemed to grow. The house wasn't just quiet. It was waiting. Rachel reached the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit by a small lamp at the far end. It was dark at the other end, where the guest bedroom was. And then she heard it again, a faint tapping noise like something was lightly knocking against the wall. With her breath caught in her throat, she crept toward the door of the guest bedroom. She didn't know what she was expecting to find. There was no reason to be afraid, right? But the tapping kept coming, like a rhythmic pattern, almost too deliberate to be an accident. She reached for the doorknob, her hand shaking as she turned it. The door creaked open and she stepped inside. The room was empty. Nothing but the bed, an old wooden chair, and the dusty curtains fluttering slightly from a draft. The moonlight filtered through the gaps in the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. Rachel stood there for a moment, listening. The tapping had stopped, but the room felt colder than the rest of the house, a sharp, unnatural chill. Her breath fogged in front of her face. She turned to leave, but something stopped her, a whisper, soft but unmistakable. Rachel, she froze, her name spoken so clearly. She knew it wasn't her imagination. It came from the corner of the room, near the window. She couldn't make out the words at first, but as she moved closer, her heart pounding in her chest, she realized it wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice that felt too familiar, the voice of her grandmother. But her grandmother had been dead for years. Rachel, come here. The voice sounded strained, weak, as if it were calling her from beyond the grave. Her grandmother's voice was unmistakable, yet the tone felt wrong, distorted, twisted. She took a tentative step toward the corner of the room. Her feet felt heavy, as though something was pulling her toward it. A cold breeze brushed past her, and the whisper grew louder, more frantic. Rachel, please. The voice sounded desperate now, and she had to stop herself from calling out in response. Something about it didn't feel right. Her grandmother had never sounded like this. Suddenly, the shadows in the corner of the room shifted. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping drastically. Rachel's breath came in short gasps, her pulse quickening. The shadows seemed to grow darker, stretching toward her. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her closer to the corner of the room. She could barely hear anything over the thudding of her own heartbeat. And then she saw it. In the corner, just behind the curtains, something shifted. It was faint at first, like a distortion in the air. But then it became clearer. A figure, blurry and unclear at first, began to materialize. It was the shape of a woman, but there was something terribly wrong with it. The figure was translucent, flickering in and out of focus, as though it was struggling to remain in this world. It looked like her grandmother, tall, frail, with the same kind eyes, the same soft features. But the face was twisted, contorted into something grotesque. Her grandmother's familiar face was stretched unnaturally, the mouth hanging open in a silent scream, and the eyes, those eyes were wide, black, like endless pits. Rachel screamed, stumbling backward, her heart racing. The figure reached out toward her, the hand moving through the air like a shadow. She turned and ran, tearing down the hallway, her feet pounding the floor as she scrambled down the stairs. Her breath was ragged, her vision blurred with tears. She could hear the whispers again, distant but still calling her name. Rachel? She reached the front door, her hands shaking as she tried to turn the knob. It wouldn't open. She pulled at it, but the door was stuck, the lock jammed. Her skin was crawling, and her chest felt tight. She had to get out. She had to get away. The whispers were louder now, all around her, and the house felt like it was closing in. The walls seemed to groan under an unseen weight, as if the house itself were alive. The air was thick, suffocating. Finally, with all her strength, Rachel managed to break free. She bolted out into the night, running into the cool air, gasping for breath. She didn't stop. She couldn't. The voice, the shadow, they were still behind her, calling to her. She ran down the long, winding driveway and into the woods beyond, never looking back. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest town. When she finally made it to a gas station, breathless and terrified, she called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. The house was empty. The door was unlocked. There were no signs of anyone having been inside, but Rachel knew what she had seen. She knew what had happened. The house had never been empty. It had always been waiting for her. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I was working the night shift at the small convenience store just outside town. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills. Most of the customers were either drunk on their way home from the bar or truckers who had to stop for fuel and snacks. The place was mostly quiet, save for the occasional car pulling into the lot and the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead. That night, the air was thick with humidity. The storm clouds had been rolling in for hours, and the wind picked up just enough to rattle the windows. My shift started at 10 p.m., and I was only halfway through when the first unusual thing happened. I had just restocked the chips aisle when the bell above the door rang. I glanced over, expecting the usual late-night customer. A man, early 40s, wearing a faded baseball cap and a dirty t-shirt, walked in. He had that tired look that most people get after a long day, but there was something else in his eyes, something hollow, like he wasn't really there. He didn't acknowledge me, not a single glance, not even a nod. He just walked past the aisles, moving with slow, deliberate steps. It wasn't odd for customers to be quiet, but it was strange for someone to not even acknowledge my presence. Maybe he was just in a hurry, I thought. The storm was getting worse. The man eventually made his way to the back of the store, where the cooler was. He paused in front of it, staring at the rows of drinks, but he never reached for one. It was as if he was frozen there, just staring. I kept working, pretending not to notice, but I kept an eye on him. Minutes passed. His stillness unnerved me, especially considering how late it was and how empty the store felt. It was as if he didn't belong, like he wasn't just a regular customer. Something about him felt off. I finally decided to check on him. I grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and walked over to him. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, my voice a bit shaky, though I couldn't place why. The man didn't move or speak. His eyes remained locked on the cold drinks in front of him. I stood there for a few moments, my patience thinning. When I finally said, "You okay there?" he still didn't answer. But then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he turned his head just enough to look at me. That's when I felt it, a chill that went down my spine, a coldness that wasn't from the air conditioning. His eyes were wide and empty, empty of any life. His pupils were black, but there was no reflection in them, no light, just blackness. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a shelf of cans. The man's lips barely moved as he whispered, "I need to leave." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't think straight. The whole situation was unsettling, but I pushed it aside, telling myself he was just a tired man who wasn't feeling well. "All right, well, if you're ready, I can ring you up," I managed to say, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. The man didn't respond. He turned back toward the cooler and, for the first time since I'd seen him, reached out. But as he did, the lights above us flickered. Once, twice, then went completely dark. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the entire store had been sucked into a vacuum. Then suddenly, the lights flickered back to life. The man was gone. My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. One moment, he was standing there in front of the cooler, and the next, he vanished like he had never been there at all. I quickly scanned the store, half expecting him to pop up from behind one of the aisles, but there was nothing. No sign of him. The storm outside intensified, thunder rumbling in the distance, and the rain slammed against the windows. I felt a chill run through me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I considered calling the police, but that seemed ridiculous. Maybe I had just imagined the whole thing, or maybe it was just the stress of the night shift. I shook it off and returned to the counter, trying to steady my nerves. It wasn't long before the bell above the door rang again. This time, a woman entered. She was middle-aged with disheveled hair and a long coat that was soaked through from the rain. She walked in without saying a word, but the moment she stepped inside, I felt the same unease I had felt with the man earlier. Her presence was unnatural. She moved slowly, deliberately, just like he had. Her face was gaunt, and when she looked at me, there was the same hollow emptiness in her eyes. The bell above the door rang again, and I glanced toward it. Another person had entered, but it wasn't a man or woman. It was a child. A small, pale boy with a torn t-shirt and dirt-streaked skin. He stood in the doorway, staring directly at me. Before I could speak, the woman in the store whispered in a voice so low it barely made a sound. "You shouldn't be here." My heart skipped a beat. I opened my mouth to respond, but my words caught in my throat. I couldn't speak. It was as if my body had frozen. The boy started walking toward me, but his footsteps soft and slow. He didn't make a sound. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his expression empty. The woman and the child moved together, their movements unnervingly synchronized. They were like shadows, silent and cold. The storm outside intensified again, and the air in the store seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare. The woman spoke again, her voice chilling in its calmness. "It's too late for you." The boy stood before me now, just inches away. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I saw it. The same black voids in his pupils, the same emptiness I had seen in the man earlier, the same emptiness I had seen in the woman's eyes. They weren't human. The lights above flickered again, and this time they stayed off. The store was plunged into darkness, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, ragged and panicked. Then came a whisper, low and ghostly. "You're not going to leave." Before I could react, the door to the store slammed open. The wind howled, and rain swept into the store, soaking the floor. I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and slow. It was as if someone was dragging their feet across the linoleum, approaching from the back of the store. But when I turned, there was no one there. The woman, the child, and the man, they were gone. I didn't know how I managed to escape that night. The lights came back on, and the storm suddenly seemed to dissipate. I ran out of the store, not even stopping to lock up. I didn't care about anything but getting away from that place. When I reached my car, I looked back at the convenience store. There was no sign of the strange figures, nothing unusual at all. The store looked just like it always did, empty, silent, and dark. I haven't worked a late-night shift since that night. Every time I pass the store, I still feel that cold chill down my spine, and sometimes when I'm alone, I hear whispers. Faint voices, soft and pleading, calling my name from the darkness. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
Lydia had always loved the old house, ever since she was a little girl. It was nestled at the edge of the town, hidden among towering trees and thick brush. Her grandparents had lived there, and she had spent many weekends with them, exploring the large property and listening to their stories. The house had a charm about it, with its creaky floorboards, large fireplaces, and windows that looked out onto a world so different from the busy city life she had grown used to. But everything had changed when her grandmother passed away. Lydia hadn't been able to visit as often after that, but when her grandfather died just a few years later, she was left the house. It was a large estate, too much for her to handle on her own, but she felt a pull to keep it in the family to preserve the memories of her childhood. At first, she thought about selling it, maybe renting it out to someone who could appreciate the space. But the longer she stayed, the more she found herself reluctant to let go of the house. The idea of it sitting empty, unused, seemed wrong. So she moved in, even though it felt a little lonely at times. She had inherited all their things, old furniture, photos, mementos, and it was comforting in a way to be surrounded by the echoes of their lives. For the first few months, everything was fine. The house felt like it always had, peaceful, if a bit drafty. But then things began to change. It was subtle at first. The lights flickering when she entered a room, the low hum of something in the walls, the way the house seemed to breathe with her. It was as if the house were alive, aware of her presence, and it seemed to be waiting for something. It was one night, late into autumn, when the first real incident happened. Lydia had just returned from the market, carrying a bag of groceries. She had taken a few steps into the kitchen when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth in one of the rooms. Lydia froze, her heart beating faster. She was sure she had locked all the doors and windows before she left. She stood there for a moment, listening. The footsteps continued. They didn't sound like the normal creaks of the house settling. They were too rhythmic, too intentional. Lydia slowly set the bag down on the counter, her mind racing. Who could it be? She lived alone, and there was no one else around for miles. Tentatively, she grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and made her way toward the stairs. She hesitated at the bottom, her eyes scanning the dark hallway. The house was completely still now, the footsteps having stopped just as suddenly as they had begun. Lydia swallowed hard and stepped up the first stair. The wood groaned under her weight, and she winced, afraid of making any noise. She climbed slowly, every muscle in her body tense, her mind racing with all the possible explanations. Maybe the house had a problem with the plumbing or the heating. Maybe it was just the wind. When she reached the top, she paused. The house was silent again. She took a deep breath and continued toward the hallway, her flashlight beam cutting through the dark. She reached the first door on her left, the door to the guest room, and when she tried the handle, it turned easily. The door creaked open. Inside, everything was exactly where it should have been. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, the air cool and still. But as she stepped in, something caught her attention. The closet door was ajar, just slightly. Lydia frowned. She was certain she had closed it earlier. She approached the closet, her breath catching in her throat as she reached for the door. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she pulled it open. Nothing. Just clothes hanging, quietly swaying in the breeze from the slightly open window. Lydia felt a shiver run down her spine as she stepped back, her flashlight beam catching something on the floor. A footprint. A wet, muddy footprint on the wooden floor right in front of the closet. But she hadn't seen anyone come in. No one could have gotten inside without her noticing. Her heart began to race, and for a moment she felt the urge to run. But she steeled herself, reminding herself that there had to be an explanation. She turned around and closed the closet door, her flashlight scanning the room one more time. The air felt heavier now, like something was just out of reach, watching her. The next few days were no better. Strange occurrences seemed to happen more frequently. The lights would flicker, the floorboards would creak when she was sure no one was there. Sometimes she would hear whispers, low voices, as though someone were speaking in the next room, though when she checked, no one was ever there. And then, one night as she lay in bed trying to sleep, she heard it again. The footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around in the hallway outside her door. Lydia's heart began to race, and her eyes darted to the clock on her nightstand. It was almost 2 a.m. She hadn't heard anything like this before. Not this loud, not this persistent. She sat up in bed, her mind racing with fear. Her first instinct was to call someone, but she didn't want to sound crazy. After all, she was the only one here. Still, the footsteps continued, pacing outside her door. The door creaked open. Lydia held her breath, her eyes wide as she stared at the empty doorway. Nothing. The hallway was dark, silent. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something move. The shadow was faint at first, but it grew darker as it seemed to move across the room. It was impossible to make out what it was, just a blur, shifting in the dark like a figure that didn't quite belong. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as she watched it, too terrified to move. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow didn't approach her, but it lingered in the doorway, watching her. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The house went silent again. Lydia jumped out of bed, her heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight she kept under her pillow. She quickly made her way downstairs, her mind reeling. She had to check the whole house. She had to be sure. Downstairs, everything appeared normal, but the unease lingered, heavy in the air. It was in the kitchen that she saw it. The old wooden rocking chair that once belonged to her grandmother. It was moving, gently rocking back and forth as if someone had just gotten up from it. But no one had been there. She hadn't even touched it. With shaking hands, Lydia rushed to the chair and stopped it, the creaking sound grating on her nerves. She felt a chill creep up her spine and a thought gnawed at her mind. Something was terribly wrong in this house. The next few days brought more of the same. Strange sounds, whispers in the walls, things out of place. The unease grew every day, and Lydia's sleep became more disturbed. She felt like she was being watched, followed, even when no one was around. She tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to the house settling or her imagination getting the better of her. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. There was something else here, something that was waiting for her to acknowledge it. One evening, after hearing a particularly loud crash upstairs, Lydia decided she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to find out what was going on. She grabbed the flashlight again, her fingers shaking as she ascended the stairs, the creaks of the floorboards under her feet louder than ever. She opened the door to the guest room. The air inside was cold, unnaturally so. The room was dimly lit, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw the figure of a person standing by the window. But when she blinked, it was gone. Something was wrong. Lydia felt a knot in her stomach, a cold dread creeping up her spine. She stepped into the room, slowly moving toward the window, and that's when she saw it. Written in the dust on the window pane was a single word: help. Lydia's blood ran cold. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind raced. Who had been in here? Who had written this? And then a voice, a whisper, faint and distant, spoke from behind her. Lydia. She whipped around, but there was no one there. It was then that she realized it wasn't just the house that had changed. It wasn't just her imagination. Someone was trying to make contact. And whatever it wasn't going to stop until it had been heard. The house was alive, and it was waiting for her. Story the end.
Story number 5.
When Emma moved into the old house on the edge of town, she didn't expect to encounter anything unusual. It was just a house, after all, and she was thrilled to finally have a place of her own. The old Victorian home, with its weathered brick and overgrown ivy, had always intrigued her. There were rumors, of course, that the house was haunted, but Emma didn't believe in ghosts. She was a practical woman, grounded in logic, and she dismissed the stories as nothing more than local superstition. The house itself was charming in a way. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, the ceilings high and ornate. The floors creaked underfoot, but that didn't bother Emma. She enjoyed the quiet, the solitude. She hadn't had a peaceful night's sleep in years, living in cramped apartments and noisy neighborhoods. This house, with its sprawling rooms and sprawling garden, was the perfect escape. The first few days were uneventful. Emma spent her time unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, and cleaning every corner of the house. It was big, maybe too big for her, but she liked it that way. It felt like there was room to breathe, space to think. But soon, things began to feel off. It wasn't anything concrete, just a feeling. She noticed it in the corners of rooms, in the shadows that seemed to stretch a little too far at night. At first, she chalked it up to the house settling, the old wood shifting under the weight of years. But there was something unnerving about it all. The house felt alive, in a way. She told herself it was nothing, just nerves, from moving into a new place. But then, one night, things began to change. It was late, past midnight, when Emma was sitting in her living room reading a book. The house was completely still, the only sound the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. The wind outside had died down, and the only light in the room came from the lamp on the table next to her. She was getting tired, her eyes heavy from the day's work. As she turned the page of the book, she heard it. A soft thud. It was coming from upstairs. Emma froze, her heart skipping a beat. She looked toward the staircase at the far end of the room. The noise had been faint, but it was unmistakable. The sound of something heavy falling. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe the house was settling, or perhaps something had fallen off a shelf upstairs. But as the minutes passed, the silence became oppressive. The thud was followed by another, and then another, each one louder than the last. With a deep breath, Emma stood up. Her legs felt shaky, but she couldn't ignore the sounds anymore. She moved cautiously toward the staircase, the wooden steps groaning under her feet as she ascended. She tried to be quiet, but the house seemed to be amplifying every little movement. The air grew colder as she neared the top of the stairs, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. At the top of the stairs, Emma hesitated. The hallway stretched out before her, the doors to the bedrooms on either side dark and silent. The sounds had stopped, but there was an eerie stillness now, like the house was holding its breath. She moved down the hall toward the master bedroom where the noises had seemed to originate. Her pulse quickened as she reached for the doorknob. It turned easily, the door creaking open into the dark room. The moonlight filtered in through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Everything seemed in its place, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was thick with a sense of unease, like the room was waiting for something to happen. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No sign of a disturbance. But as she walked toward the bed, she noticed something strange. The door to the closet was open, and inside, something moved. Emma's heart raced. She rushed to the closet, swinging the door wide open, but there was nothing there. Just the clothes hanging neatly, undisturbed. She exhaled sharply, trying to calm her nerves. There was no reason to be afraid. It was just the house settling. But as she turned to leave, she saw it, a shadow flickering in the corner of the room, just at the edge of her vision. She spun around, the flashlight darting across the space, but the shadow was gone. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what she had seen, but it felt wrong. Suddenly, she heard it again, a soft, whispering sound like a voice calling her name. Emma. She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was faint, almost like a distant echo, but it was unmistakable. Emma, come here. It came from the far corner of the room, near the window. She stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to get out of the room, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, as if something was holding her there. The voice came again, louder this time, more urgent. Come here. Emma took a step forward, her breath shallow. She didn't know what was happening. She didn't know what she was hearing. But she couldn't help herself. She moved toward the corner, her body moving almost on its own. When she reached the corner of the room, she looked down. There on the floor was a small, old wooden box. It wasn't something she recognized. The box was old, weathered, and covered in dust. But there was something about it. Something that made her chest tighten with fear. Without thinking, Emma bent down and picked it up. As soon as her fingers touched the box, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with a presence, like something was standing behind her. She felt the weight of it pressing in, suffocating her. She opened the box. Inside was a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of a family, an older man and woman, a young boy, and a girl who looked eerily familiar. The girl's face was almost identical to Emma's. It was her. But how could that be? Before Emma could process what she was seeing, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. She screamed, her heart racing as she turned toward the sound. And then, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Her hair hung in greasy clumps around her face, and her clothes were old-fashioned, tattered. The woman's eyes locked onto Emma's, and for a moment she felt as though she were looking into a mirror. Who are you? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her movements jerky, unnatural. Emma stumbled backward, the photograph still clutched in her hand. The woman continued to advance, her gaze never leaving Emma's. Why are you here? Emma managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. The woman's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a cruel, twisted thing, full of malice. You're home, the woman whispered, her voice raspy. It's always been home. Emma backed away, her eyes darting around the room for an escape. But the figure was closing in, step by slow step. The house felt like it was closing in around her, the walls pressing in, suffocating her. The last thing Emma remembered was the woman's hand reaching out, cold and skeletal, before everything went black. When Emma woke, she was back in her bed. The room was quiet again, the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway the only sound. She rubbed her eyes, unsure if what had happened had been a dream, but when she looked down at her hand, she found the photograph still clenched in her fingers. It wasn't a dream, and the house was waiting. It was always waiting. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had never been one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I thought it was all just stories people told to scare themselves, to make the mundane seem more thrilling. But everything changed one summer night when I was working the graveyard shift at the gas station just outside of town. I'll never forget it. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself, it was all just my imagination. The gas station sat on the outskirts of a small, quiet town. It wasn't much, just a lone building with a few gas pumps, a small convenience store, and a soda machine out front. Most of the time, it was a place for truckers and late night travelers to stop for fuel, snacks, or a quick restroom break. I worked the late shift because it paid more, but honestly, I enjoyed the solitude. The hours were slow, and aside from the occasional customer, the place was dead quiet. That particular night, the air was thick with humidity. It had rained earlier, and the smell of wet earth still lingered in the air. The moon hung high above the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the empty stretch of highway. I remember feeling off that night, like there was something in the air that didn't belong. But I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the usual paranoia that came with working late hours. I had just finished cleaning the counters and restocking the shelves when the first car pulled in. It was a beat-up sedan, its headlights cutting through the fog like a pair of searching eyes. I didn't think much of it at first. It was normal for someone to stop by at this hour, especially on a long, quiet road. The car came to a slow stop at one of the pumps. The engine shut off, and I could hear the sound of the driver getting out. I glanced over, expecting to see the usual late-night traveler. But when the figure stepped into the light, I felt an instant chill run down my spine. It was a man, older than I expected, maybe in his late 50s. He was tall, thin, and dressed in a long, worn-out coat, though the weather was warm enough for him to have worn something lighter. His hair was thin, gray, and wild, and his face was gaunt, with deep lines etched into his skin. But it wasn't his appearance that unsettled me. It was the way he moved, slow, deliberate, like every step took an immense amount of effort, like he was dragging something heavy behind him. And his eyes. They were dark, almost black, and they stared ahead with a hollow emptiness that made me uncomfortable. I shook my head, trying to push the thought out of my mind. He was just a man, right? He was probably tired from a long drive, and maybe the road had gotten to him. But as I watched him approach the door, something in the back of my mind told me to be careful. He entered the store without a word, and I greeted him with my usual smile. "Good evening. Can I help you with anything?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked slowly down the aisle, glancing over the shelves with a strange intensity. His movements were stiff, like he was struggling to maintain balance. It was almost like he was looking for something, but I couldn't figure out what. Finally, he came to the counter and placed a can of soda in front of me. He still didn't speak. I rang him up, and when I handed him the change, he just stared at it, his fingers twitching slightly. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the store, his footsteps heavy and slow. I watched him as he left, feeling a knot form in my stomach. There was something about him that didn't sit right. But the night continued, and I tried to shake off the unease that lingered. Hours passed without incident, and I found myself lost in the rhythm of the work. The night was quiet again, just the hum of the fridge and the occasional car passing by on the highway. But then, just after 2 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. The bell above the door jingled, signaling someone's entry. I glanced up, expecting to see another customer, but there was no one standing in the doorway. I frowned, assuming it was just the wind. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the far corner of the store near the restrooms. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone come in. I hadn't seen anyone walk past me, but I could hear them. Footsteps, dragging across the floor. They weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. I slowly turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw him. The man. He was standing at the far end of the store, staring at the wall. He didn't move when I saw him. He just stood there, motionless. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice coming out shaky despite my attempts to sound calm. I was still trying to tell myself it was all in my head. But the man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring blankly at the wall. His eyes were wide open, but they didn't seem to focus on anything. He looked empty, like a shell. I took a hesitant step toward him, my breath catching in my throat. "Sir, are you okay?" Still, no response. I could feel the air around me grow cold, the kind of chill that cuts right through to your bones. The lights above flickered once, then twice. And that's when I noticed it, his reflection in the glass. It wasn't the same. The man in the reflection wasn't standing still like the one in front of me. He was moving, walking, dragging his feet like he was pulling something heavy behind him. I turned back toward the man, my heart racing. He was still standing there, unmoving, but the reflection was no longer a mirror image. The man's face in the glass was twisted, contorted with an unnatural expression, a grimace so deep it looked like it could tear his skin apart. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the counter as I tried to get away from him. My hand shot out, fumbling for the phone to call for help, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I was paralyzed, unable to move, staring at the figure who had somehow crossed from the reflection to reality. Then, as if he'd heard my thoughts, the man slowly turned his head, his gaze locked with mine. His eyes weren't just empty, they were black. No whites, no pupils, just solid black, like endless pits. In that moment, everything seemed to go dark. The lights above flickered once more, and the room became suffocatingly cold. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. My chest tightened, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. And then, without a word, the man started to move. Slowly, purposefully, he walked toward me. His steps echoed through the empty store, louder and louder, until they drowned out everything else. My legs felt like jelly, my body frozen in fear. When he reached the counter, he didn't speak. He just stood there, looking down at me. I could feel the weight of his gaze, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I was trapped in some kind of nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The man leaned in closer, his face mere inches from mine. I could smell the scent of decay on his breath, the staleness of something long forgotten. And then, in the softest whisper, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." His words were a low hiss, a warning that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening, but I couldn't. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the man was gone. The lights flickered one final time before coming back on. The store was empty, silent. I stood there, trembling for what felt like an eternity, unable to process what had just happened. Had it been a hallucination? Had I just imagined it all? But deep down, I knew it was real. The fear that still gripped my chest wouldn't let me lie to myself. I didn't finish my shift that night. I ran out of the store the moment I regained control of my legs, not even stopping to lock up. As I drove away, I glanced back at the gas station in my rearview mirror. The lights were on, but the store was empty. Silent. I've never gone back. The place still haunts me, and every now and then when the night is especially still, I can still feel those eyes watching me. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was the first week of October when Sarah moved into the old farmhouse. The place had been abandoned for nearly a decade, and though it seemed like the perfect bargain to her, hidden away from the bustling city, surrounded by trees and with acres of land to explore, she couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that crept over her every time she arrived. Despite its age and the damp smell that seemed to linger in the walls, the house had potential. Sarah had always dreamed of living in a place like this, away from the noise, surrounded by nothing but the rustle of trees and the occasional bird call. She wasn't one to be bothered by stories or rumors, no matter how old or whispered through generations. When the local realtor had told her that the house was special and how it had sat empty for years, she dismissed it as a sales pitch, a tactic to keep buyers interested. The first night she spent there was calm. She settled into her new bedroom, the one that had once belonged to a child with its faded wallpaper and dusty shelves. The house creaked and groaned, which was expected given its age, but nothing felt threatening. It was peaceful. At least, that's how it seemed to Sarah. But the peace didn't last long. It started on the third night. She had just gotten comfortable on the couch in the living room, watching TV. The house was quiet, save for the occasional rattle of the windows as the wind picked up outside. She had been unpacking all day, making sure everything was in its place. The house was old, but it had character. She liked it. Or at least, she had convinced herself that she did. Then, a sound interrupted the stillness. A soft, scraping noise like something dragging across the floor. At first, Sarah thought it was just her imagination. But as the minutes dragged on, the noise grew louder, more distinct. She froze. The scraping was coming from the upstairs. For a moment, Sarah told herself that it could have been anything. Old houses make noises, right? It could be the wind or the house shifting or perhaps the pipes. But as the scraping continued, it became more deliberate, more rhythmic, as though someone or something was dragging a heavy object across the floor. Her heart raced, but she couldn't bring herself to move. She had to be sure. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe. The scraping stopped abruptly. Sarah stood up, trying to quiet her breathing. She moved toward the staircase, her steps hesitant but determined. Each step she took creaked beneath her feet, amplifying the sound in the stillness. She reached the bottom of the stairs and glanced up toward the darkness at the top, where the second-floor hallway lay in silence. Another noise. This time it wasn't scraping. It was a faint thudding sound, like someone was knocking on the walls, or something trapped within them was trying to escape. "Hello?" Sarah called out softly, the word barely leaving her lips before the silence returned. No one answered. She forced herself to move up the stairs, the hallway stretching out before her, bathed in the faint glow of the moonlight that filtered through the narrow windows. The air in the house had grown colder, and the weight of the stillness seemed to press on her chest. When Sarah reached the top of the stairs, she saw it. The door to the child's bedroom, the one she had been sleeping in, was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness on the other side. The scraping had stopped, but there was an unsettling presence in the air. She pushed the door open slowly, her pulse quickening as she stepped into the room. Everything was just as she had left it. The bed, the dresser, the old rocking chair in the corner, untouched. Yet something was wrong. The air was heavy, thick with something she couldn't quite place. Sarah scanned the room, her breath catching when her eyes landed on the rocking chair. It was moving, slightly, but definitely moving. Her heart skipped a beat. She took a cautious step forward, then another, her eyes fixed on the chair. It creaked, the sound almost mocking her in its regularity. The chair's motion was slow, as if someone invisible was rocking it, back and forth, back and forth. No one was in the room. No one could be. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and Sarah could see her breath fogging in front of her. She reached out to steady the chair, but as her hand touched the wood, it stopped moving. She jerked her hand back, startled, and the room returned to stillness. She turned to leave the room, but froze when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know that there was no one there. She fled down the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground as she scrambled to get away from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to have settled over her. As she reached the living room, the house fell silent again, but the air felt thick, suffocating. The next morning, Sarah told herself that it was just her nerves. She was in a new place, after all. The house was old, and it was bound to make noises. Men and she couldn't afford to be frightened by every creak or groan. But as the days went on, the strange occurrences continued. Objects would shift on their own, things would disappear and then reappear in strange places, and she would hear faint whispers when she was alone, just beyond the range of comprehension. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It was active, almost alive in its own way, and it made her skin crawl. Then, one night, as Sarah lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, she heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. "Sarah?" She bolted upright, her heart racing in her chest. The voice had come from the hallway outside her room, soft but urgent. She hesitated for a moment, waiting for the sound to come again. But it didn't. Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her feet cold against the floor. She moved toward the door and cracked it open, just enough to peer into the darkened hallway. Nothing was there, but the air felt charged, like static electricity was building in the air, and she could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as the floor beneath her feet groaned, and the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. She didn't wait to investigate this time. She ran, not stopping until she was outside, standing in the crisp, cool air under the vast sky. The house loomed behind her, its dark windows staring back as if it were watching her every move. Sarah stayed outside for hours, long after the sky had turned from black to gray. When she finally went back in, she was determined to leave. But something stopped her. Something kept her there, as if the house itself was unwilling to let her go. She went back inside, packing a few essentials, but as she grabbed her keys to leave, she heard it again, the whisper. "Sarah." It was close, so close. Her blood ran cold. She turned slowly, and there, standing in the doorway of the living room, was a figure. A man, gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and hollow. His clothes were old-fashioned, worn and torn. His lips barely moved when he spoke, but she heard the words clearly. "Don't leave." The figure took a step forward. "Stay with us." Terrified, Sarah ran, pushing past him, out the door and into the cold, dark night. The air outside felt lighter, and the oppressive weight lifted as she put distance between herself and the house. She never went back. The house still stands on that stretch of land, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar, waiting for its next occupant. And sometimes, on quiet nights, people say they can hear the sound of a rocking chair creaking in the wind. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
It was just another night working the graveyard shift at the small 24-hour gas station on the edge of town. I'd worked there for nearly 6 months, and I'd gotten used to the quiet hours and the occasional oddball customer. The fluorescent lights hummed above my head, casting a cold, sterile glow over the shelves of snacks, soda, and packaged goods. The building was small, but it did the job. Out on the highway, there wasn't much else around, just long stretches of empty road. If someone needed gas or food in the middle of the night, they stopped at our station. Most of the time, the hours passed in a quiet blur. I'd check the pumps, stock shelves, make coffee, and wait for the next customer. On a good night, I'd get through a shift without any interruptions, and that was just the way I liked it. I enjoyed the solitude, the peace of being alone in a place that most people just pass through. I wasn't someone who bought into ghost stories or any of that paranormal stuff. I thought it was all just nonsense. That night I was working alone, just like usual. My coworker Casey had been scheduled to come in at midnight, but he called in sick, so I was stuck handling the whole shift by myself. It wasn't a big deal. I was used to it. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down behind the counter, flipping through a magazine to pass the time. Around 2 a.m., a trucker pulled up to the pumps. The engine roared as he shut it off and climbed out of his truck. He was a big guy, the kind of guy who looked like he could bench press a small car. He wore a faded baseball cap, a sleeveless flannel shirt, and jeans. He walked toward the door slowly, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement with each step. I gave him a quick nod as he came in, and he returned it with a grunt. He didn't say much as he wandered down the aisles, picking out a pack of smokes and a bag of chips. I rang him up, and he paid with a crumpled $5 bill. He didn't seem in a hurry, but there was something off about him. He had that look, the kind of look that made you feel like he wasn't really there, like his mind was somewhere else. His eyes were glazed over, and his movements were stiff and jerky. "You heading out west?" I asked, trying to make small talk. He nodded, but didn't answer. I felt a strange sense of unease settle in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. It was just the late hour getting to me. "All right, man. Take care," I said as he turned to leave. He didn't reply, just walked out the door and back to his truck, disappearing into the night. It was strange, I thought, but nothing too unusual. Truckers were often quiet types, especially the ones who drove solo. Maybe it was just his way of dealing with the loneliness of the road. The night continued on as usual. A few more cars stopped in, but nothing noteworthy happened. By 4 a.m., the place was completely quiet. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and causing the neon lights to flicker. It was the kind of night where the darkness felt heavy, almost suffocating. I stood up and stretched, walking around the store to make sure everything was in order. That's when I heard it. A soft thud. At first, I thought it was just the wind again. Maybe something outside had fallen over. But then I heard it again, closer this time. It sounded like something was tapping against the back wall of the store. I froze, my heart rate quickening as I tried to make sense of the sound. There was nothing back there, no reason for any noise. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I moved toward the back of the store cautiously, stepping slowly as the sound continued. Tap, tap, tap. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow. I reached the door to the small storage room at the back of the store. The room was dark, the light inside flickering. I opened the door slowly, half expecting to find something or someone inside. But there was nothing. The room was empty. It was just a small space with shelves of extra supplies and a freezer full of frozen foods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tap, tap, tap continued, but now it seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the store. I turned around and scanned the room, my pulse racing. Nothing seemed out of place. I was starting to feel foolish, like I was imagining things. But then I heard it again. This time, it was louder. I spun around to find the source of the sound, and my eyes landed on the counter. The cash register. It was open. The register had been closed when I last checked it, but now the drawer was wide open, and the sound of metal against metal echoed through the store. I walked over to it slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one else in the store, no reason for the register to be open. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty drawer, unsure of what to do. Then the sound stopped. It was as if the store itself had gone completely still. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to check the security cameras. It wasn't something I usually did, but something told me I had to. I turned toward the small monitor above the counter and flicked through the different camera feeds. The parking lot was empty. The aisles were clear, nothing unusual. But then I checked the camera for the back room. I froze. There was someone in there. The camera feed was grainy and hard to make out, but I could see a figure standing near the storage shelves. They were tall and thin, their face hidden in the shadows. They weren't moving, just standing perfectly still. My heart stopped in my chest as I leaned closer to the monitor. The figure turned, and I could see their face for the first time. It was the trucker, but he wasn't in the store. He was in the back room, and his face, it wasn't right. His eyes were wide open, but they were completely black, devoid of any color. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The feed went blank, and the screen flickered before returning to the normal view of the empty parking lot. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. There was no way that could have been real. Maybe it was some kind of glitch. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my jacket and ran out the door, locking it behind me. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in short gasps as I sprinted toward my car. I didn't even look back. I drove out of the parking lot and down the road, my mind reeling with what had just happened. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. That wasn't the only thing that bothered me, though. The feeling that something had been waiting for me in that store, something that didn't belong there, stuck with me long after I left. I tried to convince myself that I had just been spooked by the isolation, that it was the long hours and the lack of sleep. But the image of that man's black eyes haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been following me, something that I couldn't see but had felt all along. The next night, I told my boss I was done. I couldn't go back to that gas station. I couldn't explain what happened, but I knew I'd never be able to work another late shift again. I found another job, working in a diner on the other side of town, and I never looked back. I haven't been back to that gas station since. Every time I drive past it, I feel that same chill creeping down my spine. And every now and then, when the wind is right, I can swear I hear the faint sound of footsteps dragging along the pavement, following me from a distance. Story, the end.
Story number 9.
It was a little after midnight when Emily first heard it. The scratching sound was faint at first, like nails lightly tapping on the hardwood floor. She was sitting on her couch, scrolling through her phone, the glow of the screen the only light in her living room. The night was unusually quiet. She'd just moved into the old 2-story house in the middle of nowhere, a place that had stood vacant for years. She liked it that way. No noisy neighbors, no distractions, just the sound of nature at night. But tonight was different. The scratching grew louder. At first, Emily dismissed it. Old houses made noises. It was probably just a mouse, or maybe something from the attic shifting. She'd heard about the house's history before moving in, rumors of the previous tenants, a young couple who had left abruptly, never to be heard from again. But Emily wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. She'd grown up with a healthy skepticism of the supernatural. Still, as the scratching continued, a small part of her began to feel uneasy. She stood up and walked toward the kitchen, her footsteps echoing through the silent house. She turned on the light, opened the fridge, and grabbed a bottle of water, trying to shake the unsettling feeling. The sound had stopped. She took a deep breath, letting the stillness of the house calm her nerves. There was nothing to worry about. It was just an old house. But when she returned to the living room, something caught her eye. The front door, which she had clearly locked earlier, was now slightly ajar. Her heart skipped a beat. She walked toward it slowly, cautiously. She couldn't remember the last time she'd left the door unlocked, and the idea that someone had entered her home without her knowledge made her stomach churn. She reached out to push the door closed, but something stopped her. A figure stood in the doorway. Emily froze. The figure was tall and thin, with long dark hair that hung loosely around its face. Its clothes were old-fashioned, faded, and torn, as though they had been worn for years. The figure's eyes were dark, hollow, and unblinking. It didn't move, didn't say anything. It simply stood there, watching her. The room felt colder, and Emily's breath became shallow, her pulse racing. She didn't know what to do. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. The figure stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the door with slow, deliberate steps. Who are you?" Emily managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand slowly, pointing toward the stairs. Emily's eyes followed the gesture. The stairs led up to the second floor, where she had been sleeping for the past few nights. The house had a strange layout, with long, narrow hallways and rooms that felt disconnected from each other. The upstairs was dark, but she knew she had to face whatever was happening. She had to understand. The figure stepped back into the darkness of the hallway, disappearing from view. Emily hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She didn't know what to expect, but she couldn't just stand there. She had to investigate. With her heart pounding in her chest, she moved toward the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. As she ascended, the air grew colder and the house felt heavier, like it was closing in on her. The scratching noise returned, but this time it sounded closer, almost as if it were coming from behind her. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing there. When Emily reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before her. The lights flickered, and the air felt thick as though something was watching her. The house was silent again, save for the sound of her own breathing. She knew the figure had been real. It wasn't her imagination, but what did it want? Why had it come? She moved down the hall, her eyes scanning each room. The doors to the bedrooms were closed, the air inside each room still. The bathroom door, however, was open, and that's when she saw it, the mirror. The reflection staring back at her wasn't hers. It was the same figure, tall, thin, with dark hair and hollow eyes. It stood in the corner of the bathroom, its hands pressed against the mirror, its face twisted into a grotesque expression. It didn't move, but Emily could feel its presence, pressing in on her from every direction. "Get out!" Emily screamed, stumbling backward, her legs giving way beneath her. She fell to the floor, her head spinning. She could hear the scratching now, louder than ever, as though it was all around her. The figure in the mirror didn't move, but it seemed to be growing, expanding, taking over the reflection. Emily's breathing became erratic as she scrambled to her feet. She turned and ran, her footsteps heavy against the floor as she made her way down the hallway, toward the stairs. But the house had changed. The walls seemed to stretch, and the stairs now seemed farther away, as if they were pulling away from her. She reached the landing and looked back toward the hallway. The figure was there, standing at the end, its eyes locked on hers. It didn't move. It didn't have to. Emily could feel its presence, its malice creeping toward her. The scratching noise grew louder, the sound of nails against wood filling the house. It was coming from every direction now, inside the walls, from above her, below her. The sound was deafening, and Emily's head spun. She could barely think, could barely breathe. The figure was getting closer, moving toward her with slow, deliberate steps. The door at the end of the hallway slammed shut, and Emily was thrown back against the wall, the force of the impact knocking the breath out of her. She looked around in panic, trying to find an escape, but the hallway was a maze now. The walls seemed to close in, and she couldn't remember which way to go. Everything looked the same dark wood paneling, the same flickering lights. She ran down the hallway, through the kitchen, into the living room. The front door was wide open again, but she didn't care. She had to get out of the house, away from whatever it was that was chasing her. But as she reached the door, she felt something cold on the back of her neck. The figure stood behind her, its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She could only run, her legs weak beneath her, her breath ragged and uneven. The front yard was dark, the moon barely visible through the clouds. She stumbled down the steps and toward the road, her feet bare and cold against the gravel. She didn't care. She just had to get away from the house. But as she looked back, she saw it. The figure was standing in the doorway, watching her. Its hollow eyes followed her every move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it disappeared into the darkness of the house. The scratching noise stopped. The house was silent again. Emily didn't stop running. She didn't look back. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest town, her heart still racing in her chest, her mind replaying every moment in that house. She never went back. She never spoke of what had happened that night, but sometimes when the wind howls through the trees, she swears she can still hear it. The sound of scratching, faint but persistent, coming from the walls of that old house. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
I was 25 when I moved into the small old house at the edge of town. The previous owners had passed away, and the house had been sitting vacant for over a year. The realtor told me the house had a history, a long one too, but I wasn't one to care much for types of stories. I just needed a place to stay, a place of my own. It was a cozy little home, 2 stories, with a wraparound porch and a dense line of trees that kept the house secluded from the main road. Despite its age, the house had a certain charm. The floors creaked as I walked, the doors were heavy and solid, and the walls were adorned with faded wallpaper. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine, and that was enough. The first few days were fine. I spent my time unpacking boxes, organizing my things, and getting used to the quiet. The silence in the house was almost comforting. It was just me, the house, and the occasional gust of wind that rattled the windows. But on the 4th night, things changed. I had just finished dinner and was sitting in the living room when I heard the first strange sound. It was soft at first, a faint creak, like someone stepping on a wooden floor. I froze. I hadn't heard anything like that earlier. I lived alone, and the house was supposed to be empty. I chalked it up to the old house settling. Houses make noises, old ones especially. But the sound didn't stop. It came again, louder this time. A distinct creak of wood followed by a soft shuffle. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding weak in the empty room. No answer. I stood up, my heart beating a little faster now. I walked toward the staircase that led to the 2nd floor. The noise seemed to be coming from above me, from the hallway at the top of the stairs. I hesitated at the bottom of the staircase, trying to gather my courage. Maybe it was just an animal in the attic or a draft making the house creak. But as I took a step, the noise stopped. I let out a shaky breath and started to turn away when I heard it. A soft, slow thud, followed by another, and then a faint whispering sound, like someone talking just beyond my hearing. My heart thudded in my chest. There was no one there. I was alone in the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not really. I slowly made my way up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, the air felt different. It was colder, and the silence seemed oppressive, like the house was holding its breath. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down the long hallway that led to the bedrooms. The whispering returned, louder this time. I could almost make out the words, but they were muffled, like someone was speaking from behind a closed door. I moved down the hallway, my legs shaking with every step, the cold air surrounding me like a heavy cloak. When I reached the first door on the left, I paused. The whispering had stopped. I slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the window closed tight. Everything was just as it should be. No sign of any intruder. But as I stepped back into the hallway, I felt it. A chill running down my spine, a feeling of being watched. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Slow and deliberate. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. I was alone. I turned back to the hallway, my heart racing. There was a door at the far end, and I found myself drawn toward it. The house seemed to want me to open it, like a magnet pulling me toward it. As I approached the door, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me. The whispers returned, clearer this time, and I could hear the words distinctly. "Come in." I grabbed the handle, my hand trembling. The door creaked open, revealing a small room that I had never noticed before. The room was empty except for an old rocking chair in the corner. It faced the wall as if waiting for someone to sit in it. I felt my stomach churn. The air in the room was thick, stale, and heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. But what unnerved me most was the chair. It wasn't just old, it was worn. The wood was scratched and scuffed, and the cushion was faded and torn. It looked like it had been used not long ago. I stepped into the room, my feet hesitant on the creaky floorboards. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, my breath catching in my throat. The room felt smaller now, more suffocating. And then the chair began to move. Slowly, it rocked back and forth. At first, it was gentle, almost soothing. But then it grew faster, the creaking of the wood growing louder, more frantic. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The whispers grew louder, too. The voice was unmistakable now, deep, guttural, as if someone was speaking directly into my ear. "Stay with me." The rocking chair stopped suddenly. The room fell silent. I could hear nothing but my own panicked breathing. And then I felt it. A cold hand brushed against my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst from my chest. I backed up toward the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. I pulled at it desperately, but it was locked. The air in the room grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. Then I heard a voice, low and raspy, as if it was coming from the very walls themselves. "Leave." I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my shoulder against the door, and it flew open with a loud bang. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, my legs shaking. I ran downstairs and out of the house, not stopping until I was standing in the front yard, staring at the dark windows of the house. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees, but there was no sound from the house. I never went back inside that night. In fact, I didn't return for days. I stayed with a friend in town, unable to shake the image of that room, the chair, the whispers, the cold touch. When I finally returned, I was determined to find an explanation. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the house had just unsettled me. But when I entered the house, everything felt off. The air was heavy, and the silence was suffocating, and the chair was still there. The same rocking chair, in the same corner, facing the wall. But this time, when I looked closely, I saw something different. The cushion was no longer torn. The scratches on the wood were gone. It was as if the chair had been restored, made whole again. I left the house that day and never returned. I packed up my things, sold the house, and moved as far away from it as I could. I never told anyone what happened, and I never spoke of the house again. But sometimes on quiet nights, when I'm alone in my room, I can still hear the whispers, and I swear if I listen closely enough, I can hear the soft creak of a rocking chair in the distance. Story, the end.